All right, how's everybody doing? I'm not cold, so it's a nice jacket. How's school going for everybody so far?
Not terrible.
Not terrible?
No.
I mean, I suppose that's all one can really ask for. Might not be great as long as it's not terrible and we're all okay. Have we all gotten used to going to school on campus with 30,000 people in this pandemic? Is that just like, yeah, we can do it. We can pull that off. And so it's still just so strange, but it's kind of fascinating though that we finally can see the light at the end of the tunnel, right? I have a friend who just got his first two vaccines today, and it's just like, oh, that's cool. I mean, it's like the lights at the end of the tunnel. The strange, crazy thing about him is that his wife got COVID pretty bad. In fact, he knows exactly how he got it. It was New Year's Eve. A couple came over to their house, and so there were 4 people. 3 of them within 4 days after New Year's Eve caught COVID, including his wife. He's the only one in the group that didn't get it. He even took the antibody test, didn't get it. Didn't have the antibody, so he just didn't get it. But the other 3 got it. None of them were terribly sick. They're all sick, but nothing like, by no means life-threatening, let alone hospital worthy. So he just got the vaccine. So it's like, hey, the 4 of them now, and, have the antibodies. And I got COVID, so now I have the antibodies. And it's just kind of like, okay, cool. Lights the end of the tunnel. We're either just getting sick or we're going to get the vaccine. So I'm very hopeful that by the fall, your classes that are supposed to be, I think this is like 35 or something, would be 35 with no masks. And I'm hopeful. I'm an eternal optimist, but what's the other thing I was going to say? I forget. So anyway, everybody's doing good, in terms of school starting. No one's falling behind too quickly. In terms of the first assignment you guys turn on Monday, I'll have those graded by this weekend. I'm taking classes myself. I'm getting my master's. I have a giant paper due tomorrow. I'm going to try to work on it tonight, work on it tomorrow, but as soon as that's done, then unless one of you guys want to do it for me, and I'll just give no.
How much extra credit?
Huh?
How much extra credit for it?
Oh boy, I mean, I'll buy you a coffee. So then I'll work on grading this weekend and hopefully just have that all done this weekend. So it seemed pretty easy, right? And I feel pretty comfortable about it. Is it cool not having to do an essay? Just answer a few questions. That's always a big benefit. Actually, a class I just finished yesterday, again as a student, we had to do a huge paper, 250 point paper due a week ago. And it was on a particular, I basically got to choose the subject I want to write on within a specific theme, so I chose the subject. And I was very passionate about it. It was something like I did a ton of research. My references were over 2 pages because I just was like, this is the information I want to be in depth. So I didn't quite, but I nearly doubled the word count. But I'm like, it's a master's program. Like, give me a break. Like, I was given this really intense. My professor literally took off 25 out of 250 points. I finished with 225 because I wrote too much. And I was like, what? I was too thorough? That's a thing? So for this professor's book, there's a curve of you write too few words, you lose points. You write the right amount of words, get the most amount of points. But as soon as you write too many words, you lose points. I'm like, give me a break. Now, I will say this. I don't get angry or judge a professor who does that. Any professor, because their class was their domain. So if there's any future teachers in here, your class was your domain. And I respect that as a teacher. And I don't fault a teacher for setting rules for their classes that they want to follow. So therefore, if you're a future teacher, you set a rule that maybe I disagree with, so long as it's moral, I would personally, as your colleague, as your peer, would never judge. So I'm not judging this professor, but I'm still like, seriously? I got a 95% on the paper because I was too thorough. So I just want you guys to know that that would never happen in my class. if you overwrite, I have students ask all the time, like, we get the word minimum, what if I go over? Beautiful. If it's not fluff, if you're very passionate about something, and you actually went into research, whatever, I mean, just reading a couple of pages from the textbook, and you give me 50, 100, 200 words over the limit, you're never going to write anything more than 200 words. Well, actually, I think 400 is the max. So if you gave me 600 words instead of 400, just because you're like, hey, this is the answer, and it's solid, I'm not going to ever dock a point. If I could add points, I would. We just can't get extra credit. So, just I want you to feel comfortable in your answers, and if it takes you a little bit more to answer it, then that's gold. Trust me, it's the way I see it. The more information you provide, the stronger the answer, especially when you're citing accurately. Now, if you drop way below, yes, there is a kind of curve. Like you list points if you drop below because it's like you're still in college. You got to answer your questions. But we'll see what you guys gave me on the last assignment, the first assignment. But I don't expect anything major. Does anybody have any questions, comments, or special questions about that first assignment? I mean, it was pretty straightforward and simple. Beautiful. Very good. Well, then on that topic, or on that point, we will move forward. Here's lecture 204, the effects of economic surplus. Today we're going to discuss the commercial revolution, mercantilism, and industrialism. I find all of these subjects fascinating. I'm by no means an economist, nor am I an economic historian. I am a more generic historian, if you will, but I find these topics to still be truly fascinating. We are a capitalist society, so it's interesting to learn and understand a bit about how that works, why that works. Mercantilism I find fascinating because it just is one of the most idiotic systems ever created. When you kind of contemplate what it actually means, it's like, really? You guys thought that would happen? Not granted. It grew and developed out of ignorance, and ignorance is not necessarily a bad thing. It just, all ignorance is unlearned. It doesn't mean that you can't learn. It's not stupid. It's just uneducated on subject. And at the time, the Western world was very uneducated on what resources were potentially available to them. But then, for mercantilism to develop the way it did, it blows my mind. It's fascinating. And industrialism, we'll touch on pretty briefly, but that's also very fascinating because that is the world as we know it. It's a combination of commercialism and industrialism. And so I just find these topics all very fascinating, and I hope to present them in as interesting and fascinating and entertaining way as I can. There's a part of this you'll see almost very early that is like so nostalgic to me. The endorphins in my brain just go nuts, and you'll know exactly why. I'll explain out here soon in a moment. So let us rock and or roll. Just a reminder, this is no tech class. Some of you guys are tech out, so you guys are beautiful. The reason is very simple. Every slide, every picture, every word that I present to you will be accessible to you. I upload them all to the laptop. I'll do it either tonight or tomorrow. So there's no need to take notes because I'm going to give you everything. You will have complete total access to this. However, for those of you who do need to take notes, it helps you remember, it helps you organize your thoughts. That's a beautiful thing. I have no problems with that. Just got to handwrite. Just got to be paper and pencil or pen. But also by having no tech, I don't have people sitting there just typing every word, which is, sometimes kind of bogs down time and allows them to just move a little bit more smoothly and kind of keep a good pace up. I never want to leave anybody behind. So if someone does think I'm moving a little bit too quick, like you didn't quite get something, stop me. Just, start talking and tell me, raise your hand. That's totally cool. But at least by doing it this way, it kind of keeps the pace up. We can get out a little bit earlier. We don't feel slogged down with a lot of pauses and stuff. So all that said, you guys are doing fantastic. Let's rock and roll. So let's open with the commercial revolution. I love this topic. It's so fascinating to me. So here is 17th century, i.e. the 1600s. And so although at this time, most of Europe remained agricultural economically, meaning the bulk of the wealth that was created during this time in Europe was based on agriculture, farming, that sort of thing. The fastest growing part of the European economy was the trade of goods, i.e. the production of goods that were traded for either other goods or gold and silver from another nation. So this was the fastest growing way in which people started to make money, and it soon would supplant agriculture. It would take a couple of centuries, Even the United States was an agricultural nation, really until the post-Civil War period of time. So 80-something years, almost 90 years. But it would eventually take over. The reason the trade of goods was growing as such a fast-moving economy, making true millionaires, even for that time, making some very, very wealthy people and making some very, very wealthy countries, was due to European exploration. And the fact that these nations were now, for the first time in history, tapping into the resources, the unused resources, underused resources, what have you, of the world, including both the North and South American continents, especially for the Western European nations, but then India and China and Australia, and then eventually Africa. I mean, Europeans just cut Africa up like a piece of pie. So with the tapping into all of these resources, raw materials, have been used for goods and sold all around the world, and creating this tremendous trade market. So this led to the commercial revolution, which marked an important step in human history. And that was that Europe was formerly locally connected. In other words, only regional nations were producing goods and selling to one another, and regional kind of kingdoms were selling and producing one another. They truly transformed into a global economy in which goods and services are being traded and sold across the entire planet. North and South America, Africa, China, Russia, South Asian continent, South Asia, all of this area, everywhere there were human beings, people were able to buy and sell goods from other parts of the world. And this is a truly first step, or is the true first step into the world economy, the interconnected economy that we know today. Contemplate this. I was gifted a $300 printer a few months ago. When I got it, it worked. When I brought it home, it was used, but when I got it, it worked. When I plugged it in to try to print stuff, it didn't work. There was something up with it. So I called a cousin of mine who's a computer tech, and it's his profession. And we kind of troubleshoot, and it come to find out, it appears that there's this one small computer part within the printer that's just dead. And so it's like, hey, I order stuff from this one particular company that's a worldwide computer market. So here's the link, buy this piece, and when it gets in, tell me, and I'll tell you how to install it. So I go, okay, cool. I'm literally buying this part from China. I don't know the town or province, but I was literally buying this part from China. It was shipped in my mailbox in 2 weeks. I mean, it's incredible. Like, I couldn't buy it from Iowa for whatever reason. It's not produced in the United States. It's not even produced in Canada or Mexico. It's produced in China. The fact is, I was able to order this part. It's in my mailbox in 2 weeks. That is a world economy. It's sometimes, if you were to order something from the East Coast, it's sometimes, especially around Christmas, can still take 2 weeks to get something here. And yet here I was ordering something from another part of the planet and getting it in 2 weeks. This is where that started. So as a result of this new commercial revolution, Europeans had many more products from which they could choose than their ancestors, forefathers, had during the Middle Ages. So items like tea, which is produced primarily in India, sugar, which is produced primarily in the Caribbean, coffee, which is produced primarily in China, cotton cloth, which is produced primarily in the North American continent, as well as the Caribbean. They had more books, they had new forms of learning and entertainment, they had more choices in occupation as well as consumption, not just consumption of like edible goods like tea, sugar, coffee, cotton cloth, but also the consumption of raw materials, i.e. clothing, carriages, like the raw materials for frames of homes, better constructed homes, that kind of thing. And all of these advances led thus to a rising standard of living. Now, standard of living is essentially where society says that this is the baseline of what is acceptable in our culture, in our country, for our people. In the United States today, a smartphone is a part of that baseline. If somebody does not have a smartphone, they were, in one sense at least, considered beneath the standard of living. I mean, these things are so common, everybody has access to one. The American standard of living includes not just a television, not just a box 12, 8, 14-inch TV, but a 42-inch flat-screen TV. Those are so common, if a person doesn't have one, they're considered in one aspect below the common standard of living. Not just one car, but 2 cars is the standard of living in the United States per family. Cable, readily available internet, electricity, those are all aspects of what we in the United States, and in particular in the Western world, but United States specifically, require as our baseline for standard of living. If somebody has more, they are above that kind of baseline. But if they have less, then those are truly considered the poorest among us. But even the poorest among us didn't live just, like just kings of this time. The poorest among us today live as gods. To people in the 1500s, if they had access, even the wealthiest people of the 1500s had access to what the poorest Americans have, the poorest Americans would have been considered gods to. Now, I mean that lowercase g, I don't mean literally like God-like, but our standard of living far supersedes even what was available to them, to the wealthiest of the wealthy at even that time. So people began to produce more goods for sale rather than for their own use, i.e. surplus. And as I've said, surplus is truly the word of this first 4 weeks. That's, if we could theme or define these first 4 weeks of school, in world history, that is in one word, it would be that of surplus. So people began to produce more than they would just need, or for themselves, simply so they could sell it and make more money. So Europe began to import more and more goods from the Americas, meaning China and India, primarily raw goods. They would import more raw goods from the Americas, meaning China and India, and then would export more goods such as woolen cloth, lumber, and primarily finished goods. Why finished goods in particular is because they would use labor from around the world to provide the raw materials that then Europeans would put together into the finished goods. Then they would sell those finished goods often back to producers of the raw materials as well as other markets around the world. So what does this all mean to us? So that was the world's first commercial revolution. Well, there has been another modern economic revolution that occurred in the 1900s, and that is known as the dot-com boom. This is really, we're talking early to mid-19, well, 1994 really until 99, 2000, is when the internet became the world's premier marketplace. So this is the time that included the rise of Amazon, as well as multiple other billion-dollar online companies. For instance, Mark Cuban, owner of the Dallas Mavericks. If you ever watch the show Shark Tank, he's usually the shark station on the far left, relative to the camera. He started a company called AudioNet in 1995, which later became broadcast.com. So what broadcast.com did was it literally broadcast sporting events, just kind of single game sporting events, concerts, other live events like fashion shows, that kind of thing, that couldn't be broadcast on, say, cable TV. And so you go to broadcast.com and see what are they offering. Oh, I really want to watch this hockey game, or oh, I really want to watch this fashion show, or oh, I really want to watch this concert, this lecture, whatever. And you pay a little subscription, and you get access to all of these different things. Spiritual, and you see sermons, that kind of stuff. Broadcast.com. So really innovative at that time. It was a very innovative idea. The problem though is back then technology was so, the internet was so kind of basic that it was often very grainy. Rendering, streaming was very difficult. So today it's something we do all the time. And like the NFL has sold rights to individual games to Amazon, to Twitter, there was another one like this past season, where you could only watch a game, a particular game. It's like one game every month, basically, but you could only watch it on Twitter. So if you want to watch the Buffalo Bills versus Denver Broncos one weekend, you'd have to go on Twitter, and it would have, as soon as you go on the app, the game would be there, and you just click on and watch the stream game, but it wouldn't be broadcast on ABC, CBS, NBC, ESPN, and those kinds of things. So broadcast.com was very innovative. Well, Mark Cuban sold it. He actually, it was him and another partner, sold it in 1999 to Yahoo for $5.7 billion, the equivalent of $8.8 billion today. By 2002, Yahoo shuttered it and shut down all of its broadcast services. They actually bought multiple. Broadcast.com was the primary one. They bought multiple of these services, thinking they were going to become like an online cable. And it is considered, therefore, just 3 years later, and it was done. It is considered the worst purchase in the history of internet corporate America. And Mark Cuban is still laughing about it today. I mean, he's now one of the wealthiest people because of that. Yahoo lost billions. So this is what Amazon, actually, this is what Amazon originally looked like right here. I remember this logo today. I remember this logo from back then. Very simple websites. You just click on a link, like Spotlight, I'm 16 years for books we love, offered at Amazon.com, low prices. The Spotlight moves every day, so please come often. Then it kind of upgraded to this. And so it was interesting. It started out as simply books and CDs. And so let's say you wanted to search for a specific, CD. I used to do that. You go to first-time visitors. Where's the search? Well, they had a search bar somewhere. I don't see where. Oh, search by. Oh, here we go. So you go to if keyword or advanced query. You click on those, and let's say you wanted a CD like wallflowers was one of my favorite bands at the time. You search for wallflowers, and then you get this list of wallflower CDs. Just be this simple white text with a small icon of cover, basically a very small photo of the cover. You click on that, and you put in your credit card number, and you buy it. So very, very basic compared to today. Today it's nuanced. It's almost beautiful, if you will. It's almost artistic. But that was how it looked back then. I used to just search for books and CDs, going, oh, what do they have? They had 2.5 million titles. They had everything. Others from this time, it was dotcom boom. Geocities was a web hosting service that let people create and publish websites for free and made it easy to browse such user-created websites by their theme or interest. In its original form, site users selected a city in which to list the hyperlinks in their web pages. The cities were named after real cities or regions according to the content. There were 29 of these cities. For example, computer-related websites were placed in Silicon Valley, and those dealing with entertainment were assigned to Hollywood, hence the name of the site, Geocities. So this is what it looked like. And the thing is back then, everybody had a website. Everybody, if you were just a normal person, you had a website. I created one. No joke, I created one on Geocities. It was a sports-based one. I think sports was in Philadelphia or something like that. But regardless, I don't remember what it was about, but I just was like, this is kind of cool. I want my own website. And you have a click counter, and you get clicks, and it's just well, why are people even clicking on my crap? And it was literally just made a website, but everybody had a website. And a lot, there were multiple sites. It wasn't just Geocities, but I went to Geocities because it was just kind of cool to put in this, city. Napster, is anybody old enough to have used Napster here? The only one. Okay, gosh, you guys are so young. I'm not old, so you guys are young. But anyway, Napster began in 1999, was pioneering peer-to-peer file sharing internet software that emphasized sharing digital audio files, typically audio songs, encoded in a MP3 format. As the software became popular, the company ran into legal difficulties over copyright infringement. You guys, I had thousands of songs downloaded off of Napster, and I made so many mix CDs. I still have a lot from these songs. I freaking loved Napster. And so what you would do is you would search a song title, this song or an artist, and then everybody who had their database connected to, their database of files connected to Napster would pop up. So if you were to search for, say, immigrant song, then you would search immigrant song, you'd have all these options come up, and you would literally just look for the person who had the best bandwidth. And then you would just download from it. All you do was copy it. It was literally it. And so you would have the little listing of how many people had it, who had the best bandwidth, and then just download it. So you get a new song, often about a minute or two, And imagine that, getting a song in a minute or two. Now you download a song on iTunes in like literally a second or two. But it would take a couple of minutes. Sometimes these larger files, it might take 5 or 10 minutes, something, so you just download it and walk away, or you tab over and go to, do something else. But I had thousands of songs. Napster was amazing. And you play it here, you'd have, it's essentially like a digital CD player or MP3 player, I guess. And you do mixing, all kinds of stuff. I mean, it got transferred to a device when those became available. It was the greatest thing. .com boom. InfoSpace was a huge provider of financial services. Lycos was a web search engine and web portal. Lycos also encompassed a network of email, web hosting, social networking, and entertainment sites. It was kind of like a combination of like Google and Geocities, sort of. I cannot tell you how nostalgic. I mean, I put on the endorphins. I was telling you earlier. I felt this in the third hour lecture I gave. It is so crazy. I feel like when I look at these, I kind of go back in time to like 2001 and when I was like 17 years old and just spent 12 hours a day on the internet. I saw websites that look like this. The other thing too, like the pop-up ads or the embed ads were always grainy, pixelated, and it's just, I used to watch like clips of like baseball games. You have to download like a 15-second clip. It's always a little grainy, pixelated. The audio is a little crunchy, but like, hey, I didn't have cable. My parents didn't have cable for most of my youth. So like, if I wanted to watch like kind of Sports Center Top 10, I'd have to watch that way. It'd be like really small. If I blew it up, it was pixelated. It was clear enough to be able to see kind of what went on. You might not be able to ever see the baseball. It's too small to fit the pixels, but oh my gosh, I'm telling you the nostalgia. You guys will have some 20 years from now. You will have a similar nostalgia. I don't know what, to what specifically, but you'll look back at screenshots of stuff that you look at regularly today and go like, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm 19 again. Alta Vista was a web search engine that became one of the most used early search engines in history, but lost ground to Google and was eventually purchased by Yahoo in 2003, which retained the brand but based all Alta Vista searches on its own search engine. Netscape is another, was a very popular search web browser. And what's cool is when you loaded a page, because pages just very often took a few moments to load. It was neat because this logo would move, it would morph, and you get this like comet that would fly over kind of constantly every time you let a page load. Excite was a web portal that provided a variety of content, including news and weather, a meta search engine, a web-based email, instant messaging, which was a huge deal to instant message, stock quotes, and a customizable homepage, and an Ask Jeeves was my personal favorite at this time. Search engine, because you would ask a question, something very just like convenient, like, why is the sun yellow, or did the suns win? I don't know, I just want sun twice, did whatever, that kind of thing. And it would also even give you like the most recent questions about certain topics, and you just, if you're kind of bored, just kind of bopping around the internet, you just see what is Ask Jeeves, what are people supposedly asking, and you just, what are people right now click. I loved it. So. This is the first commercial revolution. This was the second commercial revolution. What will the next one be? And could it destroy the world's economy? NASA plans to explore a 10,000 quadrillion dollar asteroid that would collapse the world's economy. 10 quadrillion is how many zeros? I forget. It's like 20 zeros. It's just huge. So it may be 230 million miles away from Earth, but this asteroid could be worth not a small fortune, but a world-changing fortune. 16 Psyche is one of the most mysterious objects in our solar system, and scientists can soon be getting a close-up view thanks to a newly confirmed NASA mission, which hasn't gotten there yet. If the asteroid could be transported back to Earth, which is that is not science fiction. That is definitely becoming science fact. The iron alone would be worth 10,000 quadrillion dollars. Its value would be enough to destroy commodity prices and cause the world's economy, worth it 3 years ago, $73.7 trillion, to collapse. 16 Psyche is located in a large asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. It may have started as a planet before it was partially destroyed during the formation of the solar system, leaving behind only its core. Now it is a 130-mile wide chunk of metal made up of iron, nickel, and a number of other rare materials, including gold, platinum, and copper. It has such a tremendous amount of all of these elements, these minerals, excuse me, that if it could be transported to the Earth, the ease of it, potentially, of transporting these goods back to the Earth would just destroy the commodity prices. I mean, like, the value of copper would go down to zero. The value of platinum would go down to zero. The value of iron would go down to zero. There would just be too much available to us. Now, that could mean greater building, greater opportunity with those elements. But those people and those economies that are based on the mining of those goods would just be destroyed, be completely destroyed. Those nations who aren't diversified would be ruined economically. Yeah.
Would we be fine since our money isn't backed up by any like gold or anything, just kind of money? You know what I'm saying? Like,
I know exactly what you're saying. What are you asking now?
Would we like? So you said economies that were based around those metals would cost, but would we be relatively untouched because of it?
Oh, no. When I say their economies are based, I mean in terms of the wealth that they produce. So those economies that rely on the trade of iron, or that rely on the trade of copper, or the sale of it, if they're able to hold value because they're able to control the amount of those minerals that are mined and then produced and turned into finished goods, which then allows them to sell it for certain prices, and that's how they make their money. So no, it would cause those commodities to just collapse because there'd be it wouldn't be an unlimited amount, but it would be a huge amount now of these raw materials, that those economies that in terms of their productive value, the production value for trade, that are based heavily in any one of these, their economies would collapse. It has nothing to do with, I know exactly what you're talking about, it has nothing to do with the backing of money in terms of gold or silver. It has everything to do with the fact that some nations, so take oil for instance, Russia's economy is very heavily based in the production and sale of oil. So they do not have a very diversified economy. In other words, it's not like 20% of our economy is oil, 20% of it is in lumber, 20% of it is in computer electronics, production, that kind of thing. It's like 80% oil. If they run out of oil, they are economically screwed because now they have nothing to trade or sell. So they produce enough to help control the value of oil so that when they sell it, they make a strong profit. So those countries, though, that are heavily based in mining and the production of, say, iron and copper and so on and so forth, if this were to be transported to the Earth, which, by the way, very extraordinarily unlikely in our lifetime, maybe your grandkids' lifetime, but regardless, not science fiction, but totally science plausible. If those nations, though, that are heavily invested in the production of those goods would be screwed because now here we have this tremendous availability of all of these minerals, and that would just screw those nations. Yeah.
So would it be like if you just printed a ton of money?
Yes. Okay. So very good. So it'd be like as if printing a ton of money. So the reason that the reason say the dollar has any value at all is because there is a limited amount. The federal government prints only so much, so that way they can control interest rates. But if they were to just print, so we're $28 trillion in debt. Well, the Biden administration has proposed a $2 trillion bill that's including stimulus that should be passed in February. So that'll push us to about $30 trillion in debt. If the federal government were to then say, okay, let's just pay off all that debt by printing $30 trillion, all of a sudden, $30 trillion of physical money would just appear out of nowhere, collapsing the entire value because there would just be so much of it available. So they have to keep it at a controlled value a controlled production to then further control its value. So it'd be the same as this, very, very true. If the more of the availability of something, the less the value, the less you can sell it for, the less profit you make, boom, your economy is screwed. So it wouldn't collapse the world's economy, but what it would cause is a transition of the world's economy. Suddenly, just the production of buildings or something would have more value because there's so much more iron readily available, and iron can be converted into steel very quickly. So does that make sense? that could be the next huge commercial revolution. All right, so with the original commercial revolution gave rise to capitalism. So the rise of capitalism occurred as private owners, as the private ownership of goods and opportunities for, the rise of capitalism occurred as the private ownership of goods and opportunities for investment led to a merchant class. Okay, so it occurred, capitalism occurred, because people unaffiliated with the government wanted to be able to produce enough finished goods to sell for a profit. And then they, in order to start kind of large businesses outside of just one's living room, which we'll get here and discuss here in a little bit, they needed financial backing, so they needed money from people who had money to then help them start their business. So have you ever heard of a Kickstarter? A Kickstarter is now a web-based investment company. Only it's not actually investing per se, it's people literally donating into an idea. So you might have an idea for a movie you want to make. And so what you do is you start a Kickstarter and you write on there and you say, I want to make this movie, here's the plot, it's going to be a great movie, but I need $50,000 to be able to pay for the cameras, pay for the rental of spots to do the filming, pay for the actors, pay for the food and snacks, that kind of thing. So you explain to people, here's my idea, I need money, I need $50,000. So people that donate through the Kickstarter, they don't expect a return, they donate to your Kickstarter. Well, that is in essence an investment. So what companies do, they don't generally as Kickstarters, they borrow money. And they borrow money from banks, or they borrow money from investors. And when an investor sends a new company money, they are in essence then buying a small piece of the return. So in other words, if I'm starting a company and I need a certain amount of money, and you give me 1% of the valuation of what I need, you are essentially buying 1% of my company. Then when I start making a profit, you immediately start taking 1% of that profit. I keep 99, but you get 1% because you gave me the 1% that allowed me to start. So which means if you give me 20% of what I need, you own 20% of my valuation. When I turn a profit, you make 20% of my profit. I'm going to keep 80, but you're getting 20% simply for giving the money to start the business. So if anybody ever watches Shark Tank, that's a little bit what Shark Tank is. It's new businesses or fledgling businesses going, I need more money. Here's how much my company is worth. Let me sell you a percentage of my company for your money. And then those sharks, if they buy in and say, okay, yes, I will buy 15% of your company worth $500,000, then they make 15% of the profits on all returns. So they not only get their $500,000 back at some point, but now they own a piece of their company and they get to keep making 15% over time. So business owners risk their own capital and money in order to start a business to make profits. Thus, the growth of new businesses led to a demand of greater sums of money. And over time, a middle class grew and money became a sign of wealth, in the growing social classes. Well, to raise these large sums, these very large amounts of money to start larger and larger businesses, joint stock companies formed. Privately owned companies sold stock in their own business, thus a percentage of the profit to investors to give more money up front. So investors bought the stock, as I just explained. Investors bought the stock of a share for the profit if it reduced individual risk in a new expedition. And when investors purchased stock, the companies accumulated money to buy larger amounts of raw materials, but it gave them a chance to develop, grow, and turn profit more quickly. Banks further developed new ways of raising and lending money. Banks and merchants became more influential in government because of this, because they were now dealing with a whole lot of money, handling a whole lot of money, because they were lending to hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people and businesses and dealing with tons and tons of money at one time. Banking, because of this, became a more respectable profession after the church eased restrictions on money lending and the charging of interest. Now, why would that be an issue? Well, it's quite simple. Biblically, debt is a sin. To have debt to someone is a sin because you are essentially enslaving yourself to another person. They own a piece of you. They own a piece of your work, your effort. That is, by definition, slavery, and the church terribly frowns upon that. You should not be indebted or, in other words, enslaved to something. So, by easing restrictions, they kind of created a gray area and said, well, your intention is to grow. Your intention is to develop. Your intention is to, is more pure. Thus, what you're truly doing is borrowing money. Yes, you're creating debt, but it's with the intention of doing better yourself. And so then they kind of created this gray area to allow bankers to lend more money to people. So you're still in debt, but they're saying, but you're in debt not out of poor decision making per se. You're in debt because you're asking for help and you're trying to get a leg up. So most trade took place in towns. Many serfs on the outskirts of towns left their manors for urban centers or cities, which increased the population therein. Does anyone remember what is a serf? Go ahead and shout it out. What was a serf?
Slave. Any type of slave.
So serfs could get out of it. So they weren't technically slaves, but you're close. You're definitely close. Did you say? Same thing. What was a serf specifically? Like, what was their role or job?
Indentured servitude.
So indenture, that is more of a slave, I guess. But again, let's try to get off of the slave aspect because it is not entirely, because they were technically able to leave after a certain amount of time. What was their role? What was their job? What's the job of a serf? Where did they work? What did they do? It was very specific. A serf was an agricultural laborer. They specifically worked in agriculture on farmland in the feudal system, who was bound to work on his lord's estate. And thus, the profit that he produced would go to his lord, who was basically just the higher up in society. So he was bound to work on that, but hypothetically, a serf could leave if they were able to develop the skills and talents to be able to find a way out. So they were not technically enslaved. It was not like a lifetime commitment sort of thing per se. Trade routes were then, because of the commercial revolution, reestablished with the East, as in Asia, and with North Africa. Why, however, had trade routes fallen in the first place? You can't go ahead and shout that. Why had trade routes fallen in the first place? Why was it that Europe at this time, or prior to this time, for a few hundred years, was pretty much completely isolated from the rest of the world? And isolated in particular from East Asia and North Africa? Anybody want to take a guess? Take a gamble? Yes, sir.
Is this when the Muslims started coming to power?
They were already, they held significant power. They definitely play a role in why trade routes had been broken off. So they played a role in why isolation occurred after trade routes broke off. But why did the trade routes break off in the first place? Somebody used to protect those roads, those trade routes, including the silk. Oh, there were multiple silk roads, but including the famous silk road. Somebody protected it and no longer did, which led to isolation because of Muslim prophets.
I'm just going to shoot a random guess. The Roman?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, that's perfect. So, due to the fall of the Roman Empire, the Roman Guard, which had protected those trade routes through to Asia, dispersed. Those people no longer had a nation to employ them, no longer had a role, and thus these trade routes were no longer protected, specifically from Muslim marauders, and as well as pirates in the Mediterranean Sea. So those trade routes both basically closed off because there was nobody there specifically to protect them, and thus Europe went into isolation, and China went into isolation after literally centuries of connectivity and through trade. So once the commercial revolution kicked off, Europeans were pretty much like, we're going to find a way to reopen trade markets. A lot of it in Asia and India, and a lot of them decided, let's just use the oceans, and finding a way around Africa, which also ultimately led to, well, let's go west and see what happens, and they run into North and South America. So, the commercial revolution increased trade, which led to more workers needing, which meant serfs moved to towns and were now paid specifically for their labor. Increased trade meant more cash, banking, and lending services were available, which meant that more money was available for building businesses. And increased trade led to merchants' wealth and expanded power, which then meant expanded power to kings and wealth to kings based on increased wealth. So some of the positives of the urban life that flourished during this period, cities and towns grew as trade grew, which led to more dense populations. And because of these more dense populations, new opportunities were created, especially for those runaway serfs. However, some of the negatives were narrow streets couldn't keep up with this great number of people. There was no city planning per se. Streets that were now also filled with animals who were defecating on the streets in all manners. There were also no sewers, so human waste was also just, no pun intended, dumped into city streets. Often, what people do is they would go to the bathroom in a can in their home, and then just throw it out the window. And so sometimes, if you weren't careful and you just didn't care, you would throw it out onto somebody. There was a lack of fresh air because, oh, go ahead.
Didn't they also have like holes in their basement? They went to the bathroom and they created like a giant pool of waste in the bottom and accidentally sometimes
Seeped into the water. Oh yeah. Oh, the outhouses would do the same. Absolutely. And so there's a lack of fresh air due to some of the new industries that were developing. There was a lack of light in some areas because, as you can see, these buildings were very, very close together and pretty tall. I mean, 4 stories 400 years ago was quite the height. And being these buildings were so close, they were kind of blocking the light. So unless you went out to an open area, it was difficult for you to in the city to get direct light. And there was also a lack of clean water for 2 reasons. First off, polluting of the groundwater by dumping all of your dumps into the ground. And then also by, again, these industries dumping their waste, their chemical waste, their production waste into rivers and streams, which ended up polluting water to the point that fresh water in many places, in particular in England, was non-existent. If people knew water was filthy, people knew that water would make you sick, so they didn't drink water. What did they drink? Beer. They didn't know why, but when they brewed beer, they didn't get sick. Thus, they didn't die. Children were given beer. They weren't given fresh water because the water, because of all the fecal matter that was seeping into the fresh water systems, were then being pushed into streams and killing people, making people very sick and killing them. So literally, they drank beer. Beer saved millions of lives. Well, literally, it's not even an exaggeration. Millions of lives at this time. Now, again, they didn't know why, but the process was very simple. To make beer, you boil water. Well, when you boil water, you kill bacteria. Now, the science of microbiology wouldn't exist for several hundred years, but they just knew, well, when I make beer, I don't get sick, therefore, I'm going to drink beer. Buildings were also, in terms of the negatives, were also made of wood primarily, and thus tremendous fire hazards. And based on their closeness, if a fire started with a building, it could take out a city. If you've ever heard of the London fire, there were multiple fires throughout history in both Europe and the United States, in which a fire started in one area and raged uncontrollably until it basically ate the entire town. And so what would happen is if a fire started and got uncontrollable, which was literally just the fact that a building went up so quickly and embers began to fly, if there was any wind at all, embers would fly into subsequent buildings, catch those buildings on fire. It was within minutes in uncontrollable fire. What would happen is that people would kind of recognize the wind is blowing this direction, thus the fire is moving in that direction. Therefore, we need to start bulldozing buildings. And they would literally find an area that was far enough away that they could kind of calculate that we can get some buildings down. This would be homes too. That we can get some buildings down and create a gap between the fire line and the next set of buildings that hopefully could mean the wind couldn't kick the embers across this new gap and start a fire. So being that most of these houses were on fire, were made of wood, excuse me, they would literally just take axes. They'd knock on the door and like, the city's on fire, we're gonna tear your house down because we gotta create a gap between this building and the next building. So they would literally just take axes, go straight at the framing and just tear that thing down and clear it out as best they could to prevent the rubble from catching fire and hopefully prevent embers from jumping to subsequent buildings and continuing the fire undaunted or unstopped. Now, by the way, does this look, does anybody recognize any gamers out there that recognizes this kind of a setting right here?
It was an Assassin's Creed.
Yeah. So if you've ever played Assassin's Creed, by the way, if you haven't and you're a gamer, fantastic series of games. This is basically kind of, just imagine Renaissance Italy with the first 3 games, I believe, all took place in Renaissance Italy. This is essentially kind of the area that you play through. And you literally walk through all this, and jumped and ran across buildings, because you could technically run across all these buildings. You go up into the bell towers, and do like the hop view and see more of the city, which will pop up on your map, that kind of thing. So fantastic games, all kind of based on this. And notice these are people right here. So you can see, and these are all pretty big buildings for what they are, for being several hundred years old. So if you've never played Assassin's Creed, but for any reason you like history and good stories, I highly recommend those games. All right, so what say you? What time is it? Beautiful. Capitalism arose out of a rise in individualism during the Age of Enlightenment after the Commercial Revolution. How has capitalism helped to shape the world of today? Social distance, Dr. Neighbors. Ready, set, go.
More ways to build better infrastructure. Because you have imports of like metals, materials, better wood, stuff like that. For example, I think it was in Hawaii when they found out that there was a tree that made really good like furniture materials. They cut it out so much they had to put barriers around trees so they wouldn't cut it down. So like, more ways to make better stuff. It also helped influence knowledge, like chess wouldn't exist if it didn't move around.
You can also create something out of it if you do within the
Also a lot of
yeah.
I think that's another reason
Hey, drummer? No, I just got happy my hand right now. I get you.
Well, there are some downsides though, because disease. Well, yeah, because it's like when you trade, you spread disease heavily. And then, well, obviously it's the most recognizable introduction of disease in North America.
The big problem with people that So we want to make more money for their.
Literally, right.
Probably much better.
Yeah.
Like with prohibition, where someone, they bought out shipping companies, so they can secretly ship beer, but saying they're shipping something else.
Oh, roger that. All right, so go ahead and just shout out, your opinions. How has capitalism, helped to shape the world of today? So real quick, not everybody at once, I can't understand a word you're saying. Just one at a time. Go ahead.
I said that out of it seemed like more governments were starting to give people like individual rights. Yeah, that's about it.
Wait, before government started giving
No, so like after capitalism started, like
Oh,
spreading
I
to
see
the
what you're
world,
saying. Yeah.
governments started
Yes,
giving individual rights.
that's a fantastic observation. Yeah, so in mercantilism, it really tried to gain wealth for the country. It wasn't necessarily for the individual. Whereas capitalism, it was gaining wealth for the individual. The country became a beneficiary to individual wealth via taxation. And so, yeah, absolute capitalism gave a rise to individualism, which in essence then gave a rise to the United States, because there's multiple layers to that, but at least from an economic sense, people in the United States, or people in America, prior to the revolution, they often came here, immigrants came here to make a living for themselves. And it wasn't make a living for the country, it wasn't make a living for the government. When I say the country, I was really meaning the government. It was make a living for themselves. It's a very individualist idea. Fantastic. So without capitalism, there is no America. What else? How else has it shaped the world today?
I think it brings out the competitive nature in people
Mhm.
and how they see others growing financially, and they want to come up with more ideas to be better than theirs, and it just
Yeah, so very good. So competition breeds innovation, right? Because if you are producing something that somebody else is producing something of, you want to produce a better product than them because you want to be able to market yourself as being a superior product, and you want to produce it at a better price because you want people to when comparing the two products, say, well, I'll spend less for the same thing, or I'll spend less for the better product. So yeah, by tapping into people's natural, and we're all naturally competitive. I mean, even the least competitive ones, people among us, are still competitive. By tapping into that natural competitive attitude, capitalism breeds innovation because it makes people want more, more wealth, of course, but also by proxy it makes them to want to produce the best product, cheapest price, to be able to harness the greatest market share. Fantastic. What else? Yeah.
I think capitalism also, oh my gosh, I just lost my train of thought. It broadened the range at which electricity was being used, because then you have longer work days with light and just worker reform, people being paid less, also less of the exploitation of workers. So,
Oh yeah, absolutely. So in regards to electricity, yeah, mankind prior to electricity can only work from dusk to dawn. So often our species was very animalistic from the perspective of we were up before dawn. We worked from dusk to dawn. We worked from dawn to dusk, working dusk to dawn. We were very animalistic in that we would be up before dawn, so that way we could work outside the sunlight as much as we could. And then we'd go to bed very quickly, very soon after the sun went down, because we needed to have the strength to work outside. Electricity allowed us to extend those hours, especially in areas of the world that during the winter there's less light, which then meant that companies expected more work out of their people, their employees, which meant that they would take more advantage of them, which meant that people were put into more harm's way, especially if they're working more tired. which then led to reforms such as the 8-hour workday, minimum wage, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, all of that was because capitalism, because these companies wanted to make more money, and then were utilized electricity to take advantage of you, the worker, which then led to a snowball effect of change, of economic and social change. Fantastic. What else? Or idiots. We just tap that capitalism tree of all this stuff, all this informational stuff. Fantastic ideas, fantastic perspectives, fantastic responses. I mean, you guys are right on ball there. And there's so much more, honestly. I mean, there's really so many different variables into it. But truthfully, as Americans, kind of one of the most important reasons is that it created a country which allowed us to exist. You know, none of us existed in this United States. There's different variables in terms of who was here, who left, and who stayed for what reason, and so forth. I mean, generation, we're talking about day one of my lecture of how many variables has it taken for us to get here, not just one of us individually, but all of us as a group to get here. It's an infinite number. Without capitalism, the United States just doesn't exist. There's no purpose for us. There's no reason for those people to have any inclination of independence. And thus, if that doesn't happen, those people don't take that step. None of us even exist. All right, so mercantilism. Again, such a fascinating subject for mercantilism. So what is mercantilism? It is quite simply the silly idea that there is a limited amount of wealth in the world and that an individual nation must accumulate as much wealth for itself as possible. Because when all accumulable wealth runs out, the country with the most remaining wealth wins. I call that silly because look at our planet. There are so many resources. It's by no means unlimited, but there are so many resources that it's kind of silly to fathom that we could, air quote, run out of resources. Yet, so I use that word from the lens of 400 years later. But back then, they were also looking at the world from a much smaller perspective. Prior to the discovery of the North and South American continents, resources truly were running low. England in particular, they did not have fresh water. They overfished the Atlantic seaboard to the point where there were less fish available, and people were now starving. An ocean that had once been teeming with billions of fish were now down to the hundreds of thousands or low millions, which meant they weren't able to cast their net and grab enough to be able to feed their own people. They deforested the entire island. England was running out of lumber. Literally, when they would build a new cathedral, which cathedrals were generally made out of brick because it could withstand greater weight and be much taller and more elegant. It was an extraordinarily expensive and difficult venture, but it had to be placed in the foundation. Those foundations would be that of lumber, and they would literally cut down tens of thousands of trees to be able to place the foundation in place, in solid enough that it could withstand the building of these new huge rock-based buildings. So they were running out of resources. So from that perspective, one can see, okay, how do they get up to the idea of, well, there's a finite amount, thus whoever has the most at the end wins. It kind of makes logical sense. The moment the North and South American continents are discovered, it's like, okay, all bets are. But mercantilism still existed. So what happened was, it was about then became control of those resources. Who can control the most resources on these new seemingly unlimited resource-rich continents? So mercantilism, if you're going to handwrite it, just write this first line. Mercantilism is economic nationalism for the purpose of building a wealthy and powerful state. It dominated Western European economic thought and policies from the 16th to the late 18th centuries, i.e. from the 1500s to the late 1700s. The goal was supposedly to achieve a favorable balance of trade that would bring abundant gold and silver into the country and also maintain domestic employment. In contrast to the previous agricultural system, the mercantile system served the interests of merchants and producers, such as the monopolistic British East India Company, whose activities were protected or even encouraged by the state. So it really did benefit the largest producers of goods, especially those that were connected to the government. Because again, it made government the most money. So why mercantilism? Well, it was after the consolidation of regional power centers of the feudal era, there came a large competitive nation states. In other words, there were a number of small kingdoms that eventually combined themselves into full-fledged national governments. So there were small kingdoms that eventually consolidated into England. There were small kingdoms that eventually consolidated themselves into France. There were small kingdoms into Spain, Portugal, Germany, so on and so forth. Then these nation states were able to establish colonies outside of Europe for the seeking of greater resources. Then further, there was a growth of European commerce and industry relative to agriculture around the world, which led to an increase in the volume and the breadth of trade. In other words, the people, the nations they could trade with, as well as the increase in the use of metallic monetary systems, particularly gold and silver, relative to barter transactions. In other words, barter transactions were simply, we'll trade you lumber for, I don't know, coffee. So you would trade lumber for coffee. Now, when you do that, yes, you're getting coffee, but now you're losing the lumber. So what nations wanted to do was actually keep both, or keep as much of both as they could. So they would trade lumber for gold. They would buy lumber with gold and then use that lumber. Hold on, I just had this. Sorry, I literally explained it just last class and I'm spacing on my explanation. Well, regardless, I don't want to pause for too long. The intention, though, was to keep as much of their resources as possible while accumulating gold and silver, because gold and silver, these coins and bars could then be used to buy other goods. So, in practice, would mercantilism help be a cause for more wars or for less? Why or why not? Take about 30 seconds. Social distance type neighbors. Ready, set, go. Oh, right. So in practice, would mercantilism be a cause for more wars or less?
I said more, because you're creating a lot of nationalism. A lot of, I gotta make money not only for myself, but for my country. I've gotta produce lumber, I've gotta produce wool, I've gotta produce all these things. Usually, like when we see nationalism, a rise in nationalism in history, there seems to be more wars, more like territorialism. Like, you look at the Nazis; they were very proud of their country. You look at the Civil War; both sides were proud of their country. They wanted to do things the same way. Revolutionary War, the colonists were proud of what they wanted to be their country. Same thing with Britain. So that's what I've seen.
Very good. Who else? Mercantilism, yes.
We said a couple things. One of the things kind of tagging along to is nationalism. Like you mentioned that they were thinking that everything was going to run out. So everything was going to run out. They wanted to make sure they had all of it. So they would go to war to make sure they were the best, had everything, and like were kind of like the top nation. But also it could cause wars because they couldn't agree on what to trade on. So like the price differences or disagreements could end up in like wars.
Beautiful. Who else? Anybody else? Perfect answers, both of you guys. Yeah, so mercantilism led very much to more wars for both of those reasons. The rise of nationalism and the idea of we're better than you, we want to be better than you, superiority, and also the understanding that, well, if this pie is limited, we want as much pie as possible, and somebody else has access to greater resources than we do, we might as well go to war and take those resources, have access to themselves, because that helps us to have more in the end when we run out, essentially. And then, of course, there's also the idea of trade wars as well, which have occurred as well. So during the Mercantilist period, military conflict between nation states was both more frequent but also more expensive than any time in human history. Recall the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War that we studied most and that we recognize most from American history was the fourth French and Indian War between the English and the French and Indians so the French in the European continent and the French and English in the North American continent. There were four of them. That fourth war is known in American history as the French and Indian War, but in European history it's known as the 7 Years' War. Why? Because that bloody war lasted 7 years. The first of the four wars was also known, which is known as Queen Anne's War, was actually a 9-year war. You guys have probably heard of in European history the 100 Years' War, because that war literally lasted 100 years. A war that one generation started wasn't completed until the great-grandchildren of that original generation finished it off. There was also an 80 Years' War. There was a 40 Years' War. These things would go on forever. Our Civil War, just over 4 years. World War I, about 5 years total. The United States was in it for about 13 months and on the battlefield for 8 months. World War II was about 6 years. The United States was in for 4. These things used to go on forever. So the armies and navies of the main protagonists were no longer temporary forces raised to address a specific threat or objective, but were actually full-time professional forces. Again, kind of think back to our knowledge of American history. Who was here on North America, on the 13 colonies, but the standing English Redcoat Army? They were here just kind of occupied, because for a number of reasons, but they were professional soldiers. That was their job. That was their career. They joined the army. They were there for life, and they just moved up the ranks if they had the social standing to do so, and did so for many, many years. That was new in human history. If you think back, though, to the Crusades, those people who fought, they were told, hey, we need you to fight. They would fight. They came home. They became farmers if they survived the fight. They were not professional soldiers, but just waiting for the call to go to war. Each government's primary economic objective was to command a sufficient quantity of hard currency, i.e. gold and silver, to support a military that would deter attacks by other countries, to support a standing military that would deter attacks by other countries and aid its own territorial expansion. So, no two fully capitalist nations have ever gone to war with one another in the history of the world. Why, if it was so frequent during the mercantilist era, is it so infrequent during the capitalist era?
Probably because they're not competing, they're working for competing. Like they're not trying to steal each other's wealth, they're maybe using it to each other's advantage.
We're not necessarily trying to steal each other's wealth, we're just trying to use our kind of trade strength to our advantages, yeah.
They need allies.
You need allies to trade with, yeah. What else?
Maybe because when the people that decide if we go to war or not, they look back at history, they realize the cost of war, like the monetary cost and then the human life cost.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure that I'm positive that leadership around the world just kind of look going to war. We're probably lose 100,000 people or more. Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure that plays a role. Anybody else?
Allies that you already have, let's say that Italy tries to invade Germany. Germany has allies and is outnumbered Italy, and Italy has no allies, so it's not trouble.
So while that's a plausible answer in a strategic sense, just from an economic sense, it doesn't apply to the economic conversations, I'm saying. Yeah, it's possibly true. I mean, technically, Italy and Germany are allies. I understand your illustration. But from a non-militaristic situation, what is it built from an economics?
Well, then afterwards, like, no one wants to trade with Italy because they are afraid that they might damage trade relations.
Yeah, you're not. I was projected. You're not necessarily inaccurate, but again, it is kind of pulling on. Because look at Germany and Japan after World War II. As soon as that war was over, the Allies and the United States in particular went in. They set up new governments immediately that were democratic and free trade, and immediately trade began with those two nations. And Japan became America's greatest producer of electronic goods within a decade of the end of the war. And it was simply because the winners went and installed governments that were open to it. Now, if, say, Italy were to win that war, yeah, that's something different. But now we're looking at a totally different problem all of its own. And capitalism isn't really an issue there. It's really about, like, holy crap, like, there's something going on. But so, in the end, though, correct. Why don't capitalist nations go together? Well, because, first off, nobody's really competing anymore, especially modern industrial nations, aren't really competing anymore for resources. They're able to just buy or trade resources however they need. Secondly, nations are now, through this trade, through free trade for the most part, they're so interconnected with one another. The United States and China are, well, politically conservatives in the United States are diametrically opposed to everything that the communist Chinese government stands for. And so, economically, though, so right there, that would kind of be an impetus, potentially, arguably, for war at some point for some reason. That said, the two nations are so economically connected. If the United States were to go to war with China, or China, were to instigate war with China, or China were to instigate war with the United States, obviously that means we're cutting off our trade right there. Now, the United States does not have billions and billions and billions of dollars of goods purchased from China every year. We as citizens are now going, well, we want more of our stuff. We still want to get more access to these goods. The Chinese then lose billions and billions and billions worth of American dollars who are buying their goods. So right there alone, now granted, China's not a capitalist nation. They're absolutely socialist. They have enough capitalists. So I would call us a capital C capitalist hyphen lowercase s socialist nation. They're a capitalized S socialist hyphen lowercase c capitalist nation. They have enough of it in there that economically we're just so tremendously ingrained with one another that war just doesn't make sense. If at least, let's say the United States and Italy, the United States and England, the United States and Germany, capitalist nations, although they're definitely leading socialists too, but capitalist nations that if we were to go to war with them, we lose a lot of goods, a lot of trade, they lose a lot of money, so they're not about to declare war on us, so on and so forth. It does get more in depth than that. So the basic assumptions of mercantilism was that wealth, i.e. gold and silver in particular, led to national power, and thus the two had a symbiotic relationship. The more wealthy a nation was, the more powerful they were. Thus, national wealth was essential for gaining and maintaining that national power. So, if wealth is all that leads to one's assumption and understanding of power, like we've been saying, and there's finite amount of resources, you're going to fight over those resources because you're going to fight over that wealth because you want to be number one. You want to be the nation to take advantage of others. You don't want to be the nation to be taken advantage of. Thus, national power is similarly essential for securing, maintaining, and protecting and increasing national wealth in terms of precious metals. And foreign trade is the primary source of national wealth, again, in gold and silver, and thus of national power. So you wanted to trade goods to accumulate as much gold and silver as possible. Those are the most expensive of the precious metals, and thus, those are the most expensive precious metals, but the most sought after precious metals as well. and thus a sign of national power. So the most common elements in early modern mercantilism was bullionism, the policies to ensure a steady influx of precious metals, gold and silver, and prevent their outflow. Bullionism was the economic theory that defined wealth by the amount of precious metals owned, and had a doctrine that all paper money should at all times be convertible to bullion. So the United States, our economy used to be based on bullionism. It was the gold, the gold standard and the silver standards. So in other words, our dollar bills were actually IOUs. In other words, you had a dollar bill that actually had a dollar's worth of gold attached to it, or a dollar's worth of silver attached to it. So you had this IOU that you would take to a bank and say, I want $1 in gold, or I want $1 in silver. And then the government was also connected to that. So when they wanted to trade or buy, they would convert dollars to gold and silver. Eventually, that got, all nations got rid of that. So now all money, all major economies on planet Earth, or no major economies on planet Earth are based on gold or silver anymore. That just doesn't exist. They are all based on a promise. So now your dollar bill is not based on gold. It's based on a promise that that dollar is worth $1. What is a dollar? A dollar is a promise. Your $10 bill is a promise. This $10 bill is worth $10, we promise. $100 are the same. So what then is $1, $10, $100 worth? Well, whatever the market decides is worth, because $10 can get you, a couple of Whoppers, but can't get you a TV. Thus, you need more promises in order to afford that TV. So this is known as a fiat monetary system, where a government simply says, here's our currency, we promise it's worth as much as we say it is. And we as a society then go, we accept your promise, thus giving that currency value. And that is it. The only reason why any paper money has any value at all is because we accept the government's promise that it holds value. That is it. The moment we decide as a people, our dollar is worthless, just our decision alone, boom, destroys the value of that dollar. And that promise is broken, and thus the value is gone. So all nations in the world major nations are on this fiat system. So the American dollar and the Canadian dollars are worth American and Canadian promises. The euro is a euro promise. The ruble, is a ruble promise that this is worth 1 ruble. What is it worth? I promise you. Okay, and we just accept it. It didn't used to be that way. It used to be an actual IOU for a physical, valuable coin, bullion of gold or silver. And then economic nationalism was fierce competition with other nation states. So Adam Smith was one of the most famous economists and economic thinkers of this era of history, and he had several criticisms of the mercantilist doctrine. He believed that forget trying to accumulate wealth for yourself by screwing with the country. Trade, when freely initiated, benefits both parties. Because if you have an excess of lumber and they have an excess of coffee, and they need lumber and you need coffee, just trade. Now you've got plenty of lumber and you have plenty of coffee, and they have plenty of coffee and they have plenty of lumber. And if you've got a double excess of lumber, you can buy, trade some for coffee and some for cotton. And now you utilize your surplus excess lumber and just bought your nation coffee and cotton. So Adam Smith is like, well, duh. Now you don't have to kill each other by recognizing this. You don't have to literally kill each other for resources. You just trade. You find what you have an excess of. You find people who are in need of your excesses, and then you trade. But now let's say, for the sake of argument, that I have a ton of lumber and I need coffee. However, the coffee people don't need my lumber. So what they need is cotton. So what I do is I trade my lumber for cotton that I don't need. Then I trade my cotton for coffee. And voila, I'm able to get my coffee. Make sense? And that's a free trade. And it maybe took 2 moves, but I didn't have to kill anybody to get it. And now my people have lumber, cotton, and coffee. She further said the specialization of production allows for economies of scale, meaning huge economies, which improves efficiency and growth. This is something I talked about on Tuesday. If you watched the lecture already, which if you haven't, you've got until like tomorrow. Just get it done. Send me your notes in the video and what I use, and I'll give you your points. But we talked about division of labor, and that is that when a person does a particular job, a specific aspect of a job, consistently, then they get skilled at it because they do it over and over and over again. It becomes kind of second hand. You know what I mean? It becomes kind of a natural thing. Well, what the idea of division of labor says is that when you do that, and you've got people doing the exact same job, they become very good at it, which means they become very fast at it, which means they become efficient, which means they produce more. The slower you are, the less efficient you are, the less you produce. The more you do it, the faster you become out of habit and skill, the more efficient you are, the more you produce. But there's a second side to that. The more you understand something, the more you look for shortcuts. You look for ways to make it easier on you. Because you know this thing so well, you start to look for ways to innovate. When you innovate, you then become even more efficient, which means you produce even more. And that's a huge thing in the business world, in the industrial world. You want innovation. You want thinkers of people who do a job so often, they understand it at the back of their head, and then they go, I can make it even easier. I can make it even faster. If we do this, we can produce that much more, which means we can make more money, can't we? Well, he said, hey, specialization of production will give you more. You want more? Become a specialized society. Then he said the collusive relationship between the government and industry was then harmful to general public. So what this is that the government was really just kind of, under mercantilism, was just siding very closely with the major production companies, major production centers, because they were making the government money. It was all about bringing money to the king. And it was at the denigration of the general public, those laborers who were doing all of the hard work. Human beings were treated like old ratty shirts. You got hurt to the point you couldn't work, you were fired. It wasn't, oh, okay, well, hold your, no, you're gone. Because we can't afford to be inefficient. You're now a broken cog in this machine, and they were thrown on the street. If you died, sorry, replaced. There was no compassion. There was no humanity. People were treated like trash. That didn't change here in the United States until the 1910s, 1920s. I could go on that, but I'll move forward so we can end here in a couple minutes. So that was Adam Smith's complaint about mercantilism, which, eventually led to the Industrial Revolution. So the Commercial Revolution was when Europeans expanded the power worldwide from the 1400s to the 1600s. This included colonies in both the Americas, North and South, as well as Asia, including China, India, Africa. This also included increased trade and commerce. The guild system, which was basically a union system among clock workers, they could not meet the demands of increasing number of goods, and so nations looked to innovate. Well, at first, after the commercial system began, it really began as a domestic system of production, which continued from the late 1600s to the late 1800s, in which raw materials were delivered to a worker's home, literally their home. They would just keep stored raw materials in their house. The workers then manufactured goods from these raw materials in their homes. Then business people, basically a shop owner, would pick up finished goods, pay the workers' wages based on the number of items, and then sell them in a shop. However, the domestic system could not keep up with demand. Well, think about why. Very simply, you're building it in your home. You're building it by hand. It's a slow process. The moment you take a break, you're not making anything. It takes longer then to finish that good. You have to sleep for at least 8 hours a night. Well, maybe for at least 6 hours a night. But that's 6 hours where you're not making anything. And often it wasn't mom and pop, it was pop, while mom was taking care of the kids kind of thing. So it's a very slow process. And then you're keeping the raw materials in your house. I mean, it's just clunky. It worked, it served a purpose, but it was inefficient and thus required innovation. This was replaced then by the factory system. Factory system replaced the domestic system because it provided a much faster method of production. Workers were then concentrated in larger numbers in a set location, and production could anticipate demand. In the domestic system, you made your products based on orders that were already placed. Hey, shop owner tells the clockmaker, hey, I have 5 orders for clocks. Okay, I now make 5 clocks. So then the person who orders the clock has to wait weeks until the clock is made. In the factory system, they were able to anticipate demand. Factory companies could say, we project to sell 200 clocks in the first quarter. So the factory system would say, okay, we will make 200 clocks for you before the first quarter. Now a store held those clocks in storage, put them up on the shop, people would walk in, they would buy completed clocks. That's how we shop now. The way we shop and everything's already made. We now buy what is available. So that all started the factory system, which was one of the early steps of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution itself was a fundamental change in the way all goods were produced, from human labor to machines. The more efficient means of and subsequent higher levels of production triggered far-reaching changes to industrialized societies, created more jobs, created more products, expanded markets, offered opportunity for sale, offered opportunity for innovation, offered opportunity for business, startup opportunities, a great number of things. It changed, it offered greater opportunity for pollution. It changed the world in ways that people 20 years prior, 100 years prior could have never, ever fathomed. England was the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. There's no specific or concrete start date from it. It just kind of happened organically, very fluidly. It was marked by gradual, slow changes. However, by 1750, it was noticeable. There were factories everywhere. There was pollution. People were moving into cities. They were working in this big industrial buildings, and they were making money. Oops. So why England, though? Why did it start there? Well, essentially, they were, of all those nations that were competing to win, they were winning. They had the capital or money to invest in the starting up of these means of production. They had the colonies, of which they had people producing the raw materials. There were also then future markets for the production of these manufactured, or excuse me, not for production, but for the sale of these now manufactured goods. They had, because of those colonies, the raw materials available to them, the workers. They then also had the strongest navy. They had a merchant marine, which these are ships specific for trade, not war. And they had the geography. Not only were they right there on the eastern or western shore of the European continent, but they were a straight shot to North America. They had, being an island, they had 100 ports. Anybody could come in, so they could have stuff going in and out constantly. There was no backup. There was no lines to get in. It was just, hey, let's move and keep a fluid system. In terms of their wealth, okay, we can skip that. So I have this here for you when you go through the assignment. Just know that there is more information about moved resources, so it's something you can tap into. And then finally, new advances in the textile industry. I'll fly through this so I can take 10 seconds out of here. Several major innovations modernized the world, in particular the cotton gin, modernized the cleaning of cotton with dirty seeds and helped to separate cotton at a much faster rate. There then became a huge demand for cotton cloth, so John Kay's flying shuttle helped cotton producers weave cotton to cloth fabric. Eventually, the spinning jenny made that even more efficient and helped to increase the speed of spinning cotton. Now, these are innovators. I mean, these people are inventors. They're innovators. These are, hey, I work in this field. How can I make it faster? How can I produce more? They invent. They're innovators. These are like the people who helped make the economic engine of the world, but of America in particular, move. Further after that, in 1769, Richard Arkwright's water frame produced spinning machines powered by water, which allowed them to move perpetually. These machines would be placed in industrial sites on rivers. They would literally use the current of the river to push these wheels to then just turn all these gears and gadgets, and they could move so long as there was a current, and there was always a current in the water. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, unless the water itself froze over, which rarely happened. You've got constant moving water, it's hard for it to freeze. You could produce goods and have very few people to manage a great number of machines. The steam engine was extraordinarily important. Britain also had plenty of coal and iron ore needed for industrialization. In terms of transportation innovations, turnpikes, private roads that charged users for a fee, canals boomed. And so you had these are little like market roads. Canals boomed. Canals are artificial rivers. They're man-made rivers that connect regions, but allow for the movement of goods at a much faster and efficient rate. It is a lot faster to move even the heaviest things floating on water than it is on land. So canals were developed all over the place. If you've ever seen a map of canals in the United States that were designed specifically to move goods, they are everywhere. It looks like a virus injected into the veins of the nation. Steam locomotives, of course, which were primary, hugely important for America. Here they are in England. 1840 to 1850, just in 10 years, the island of England was extremely well connected. Oh, okay, so that's the end. All right, so again, I have to take attendance, so just give me a couple more minutes. But here's our second assignment. I know you just completed the first assignment on Monday, but just looking forward, you still have now a week and like 10 days left. But it's 3 parts. First part is filling out this chart. It is which is two-sided: agricultural revolution, industrial revolution. So you complete the following matrix, answering the questions, and this is literally the chart that you'll see. It's a dot file. Complete the following matrix, answering the questions regarding the agricultural and industrial revolutions, making sure to include a minimum of 1 citation per box, so you have to cite, so on and so forth. You may cite things multiple times, you may use the same references multiple times to cite, but you still have to cite to show evidence of your argument. Each answers in each box must be 25 to 50 words, so 25 to 50, 25 to 50, yada, yada, yada. Then you use the material in this matrix to answer the 2 kind of long answer questions. So the first one is, in 250 to 300 words, take one item cultivated, built, assembled, or harvested during the agricultural revolution and explain its life through its entire use from the beginning to end, providing specific details that correlate with each stage of the process as reference to the first 4 questions in the matrix. In other words, how is the surplus created? How is it controlled? How are the common people affected by it? If the surplus disappears, who's to blame, and so on and so forth. So be sure to include at least 1 citation for that specific answer. So one example of a very abbreviated answer would be, in the modern era, cotton is picked, cleaned, stretched into thread. The thread is woven into fabric, which is then cut from patterns into clothing, then shipped to stores for purchase. So this is an extremely abbreviated answer of how you then choose an item cultivated, both assembled or harvested during the agricultural revolution, and you take it from beginning to end, the beginning to end of its life. Then the second question is the exact same thing. Take one item cultivated, both assembled or harvested during the Industrial Revolution, and explain its life through its entire use from the beginning to end, providing specific details that correlate with each stage, yada, yada, yada. That's it. So it's a very straightforward, simple assignment. Fill out this chart first, answer those 2 questions, and you're golden. And that's it. Any questions, comments, concerns, spatial switches there? No? All right, let me take attendance and we're out. Who's hungry? We didn't have this, we should have this 5 o'clock class catered. Like pizza or something, right? All right, if you're online, thank you.